Welcome to Justice Beyond the Bench, a podcast by the International Association of Women Judges. I'm Jane Charles Voltaire.
And I'm Amy Lewis. In this series, we spotlight women across the global justice sector who are leading efforts to advance gender equality, strengthen judicial systems, and champion inclusive leadership.
From courtrooms to communities, we'll hear powerful stories and unpack the strategies shaping women's leadership in law and the judiciary. It's time to go beyond the bench.
Today, we are here with Mandira Kalra Kalaan, Global Leader, Gender and Head of Office of India of Purpose, to discuss the Difference She Makes campaign.
Purpose is a campaign and movement incubator, a global team of creatives, strategists, and impact specialists, all driven by one mission: to move people to remake the world. They design breakthrough creative campaigns that shift narratives, inspire action, and influence decision makers. By using the power of storytelling and public engagement, Purpose builds unexpected coalitions, amplifies new and diverse voices, and drives impact on some of the world's biggest challenges.
Mandira has over 20 years of experience in strategic and creative communication. She specializes in narrative and behavior change communication across a wide range of issues. Her areas of specialism include reproductive health and rights, social justice and equity, gender and sexuality and rights, women's leadership, workplace equity, intersectional approaches to climate justice, and climate adaptation. A social anthropologist from the London School of Economics, Mandira has worked across multiple issue areas and mediums, including TV, film, animation, digital, and interpersonal communication.
Previously, Mandira led communications at the Population Foundation of India, focusing on campaigns on gender, reproductive health, rights and gender, as well as adolescent issues. She has also worked as an independent consultant for UNICEF and the World Bank, is the co-founder of Vana, a social enterprise supporting traditional handloom weaving communities across India to preserve traditional handloom techniques and craftsmanship, as well as providing weaving families with direct-to-customer opportunities.
Welcome, Mandira, to Justice Beyond the Bench, the difference she makes, changing the narrative, transforming the system. We're so happy to have you here today with us, Mandira.
Yeah, welcome.
Thank you so much. I'm so excited to be here.
To start us off, what is the Difference She Makes campaign all about, and how does Purpose fit into this work?
Thanks. And I think to talk about the Difference She Makes campaign, I think I need to start with where we are in the world today. And the year 2025 is marked just a series of pivotal global shifts, geopolitical shifts that have really changed social landscapes around the world. There's been a reordering of global priorities, increased restrictions and backlashes around gender and reproductive rights. And civil society partners are feeling, heightened scrutiny. Freedom of speech feels like it's shrinking in many, many contexts. And in many cases, this has led to backsliding on gender policies and legislations. More than ever, and we keep hearing this, more than ever, we feel that audiences are divided, isolated. And that isolation is creating kind of really entrenched opinions and this kind of polarization between audiences. And it's in this context that we launched Difference She Makes, which is a narrative and perception shift campaign designed to address this pushback, but really focus on women who are thriving and women who are leading in the legal sector. The campaign layers on and leverages work that a number of partners in this field working on women in leadership in law, such as yourselves, are doing around the world. And the idea is to really reduce resistance and inaction that they face from gatekeepers, institutions, decision makers, and at the same time increase support for improved practices, reforms, policies that really enable women's leadership, women's advancement, and that too at all levels of the law and justice sector, not not simply for women who are already in positions of leadership, but really thinking through what that pipeline of leadership means. How do you keep women in the sector? How do you encourage them? How do you amplify them? How do you actually create a sector that is gender friendly and gender positive in a sustainable manner?
So, Mandira, we describe purpose as a campaign and movement incubator. And I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about why purpose was chosen to lead this initiative and what unique approach do you and purpose bring to this work?
Sure. Thanks, Amy. So yeah, you're absolutely right. Purpose is a campaigning and movement building or incubating organization, and we've incubated movements around the world over the last 16 years now that drive impact on issues such as gender, equity, climate change, public health. And really, purpose comes to this from a view of thinking through audiences, messages, messenger, and really thinking through about how do you shift power. And the idea that if you build communication strategies that are culturally rooted in local experiences and lived experiences that are culturally resonant and relevant, and mobilize people to come together to act on issues that they may not be engaging with, you can really build powerful movements around the world. Some of the strategies we use is to ensure that we're always thinking of how do you bring what's the ecosystem? Who's talking about this already? Who can shift opinion? Who can change things? Who has power? But also thinking through power in new and different ways. So often when we think of power, we think of those who have power. But also there are large groups of people. Take youth, for example, right? Who may not immediately come to mind as a cohort that have power, but have the potential to be able to shift power and have the potential to be able to shift opinions and shift decisions and things like that. So really not just thinking through power in a traditional sense, but coming to it from a more democratized sense, I think. And so we really began this work to start from the point of how do we leverage the really deep expertise of everybody who was already working on the issue. We're a campaigning and movement building organization. How do we bring everybody who's working on the issue together around a singular vision, a singular ask? And that's often what drives our movement building. How do you bring together movements that are intersectional, narrative led, culturally responsive? And I think that's some of the reasons why we were kind of engaged with to do this work. We've been really lucky to work closely with partners like you, Amy, and Jane, and others around the world to really design an approach that we feel responds to what we were hearing from those who were working at the forefront of women in leadership in the legal sector, and really thinking through how to balance what was required, what were the risks, who was missing from these conversations, what did it look like from a global perspective. And the approach is, I believe, quite unique, and I think something that I'm quite proud of is how important the culture is in this piece. Culture mapping, social listening, design thinking, creative and campaign strategy is really critical to this work. We start from the point of what's currently the story being told in the media? What's popular culture talking about women in leadership? How are these things being represented in cultural tropes across media, social media, alternative media, but also in everyday conversations, and how people respond to position holders or decision makers. And that really defined what that approach was. And so, we wanted to break away from the audiences we all constantly speak to, step outside echo chambers, really look at who are those hard to reach audiences. Can you build a bridge to those audiences and shape that conversation, really being responsive to what are the negative perceptions and conversations that are happening in real time every day on very public forums on the issue, and how do you address that in constructive ways, in ways that engages in a dialogue rather than a polarization of opinion. And really looking at how do you reach new audiences? How do you identify who's trusted? Who are the cultural messengers who can help you reach those audiences? And then finally, we really, all of this is deployed through kind of a multi-touch point, mixed media storytelling campaign that will, sit on multiple platforms, multiple ways of communicating, multiple formats. There'll be podcasts, there'll be videos, there'll be animation, there'll be articles. It's just a kind of, it's a real mix. So it's addressing many different audiences at the same time.
Thank you so much, Mandira. I think that in terms of focusing on what can be done, what are new audiences, how to shift perspective, it's really refreshing in many ways to hear about how purpose and how the difference she makes campaign is trying to navigate this new landscape as you speak of it, and ways that we can get creative in reaching new audiences and those that we might not traditionally think of as having power. I think it's really great to be able to understand also, for our audience today, why it's important to focus on narrative change and advancing women's leadership in law. And can you talk a little bit more about that? And how does this campaign specifically aim to shift perceptions of women in the legal profession?
So I think for us, a key piece of this, a key part of what we heard was, and I think one of the things that I'm proudest of is the hero stories that have started going out from the campaign. And the idea was to take stories from women we met through our research, through the conversations we've had, women often who were working in the legal sector, who had had very real and very lived experiences of negotiating with what leadership meant to them. Really negotiating between thriving, but also having backlash, having to negotiate between family, between gender norms that didn't necessarily support their leadership. And something we really came to this with was often the conversation around women's leadership starts and ends with the first. So very often you'll hear, for instance, in the context of my own country, I've heard it so often, oh, you've had a woman prime minister. Women are in leadership in India. That's evidence, therefore. So very often, just that first starts and ends the conversation. And we were very clear that we wanted to push beyond that. It wasn't about the first, but it was about opening a door, and those who follow, those who are making changes in their everyday, what those histories and stories are. So it was very much about going beyond that first. And that's why, and that's one of the big perceptions that we've really tried to shift, because our research showed clearly that that first conversation tended to close other conversations. It was done. We've done our bit. We've got a woman on the Supreme Court, or we've got a woman who's the head of a law firm. And so that was one of the key things that we wanted to address. Some of the other things was really around going beyond a gendered lens on, kind of put this in quotations, but on characteristics. The more we researched, the more conversations, it was very surprising to even hear women leaders within the sector define women as too soft or too empathetic or too biased. And we wanted to change that. So we really focused on it's not just leadership, but it's about feminist leadership. And what does that look like? And so really going beyond some of those. And then finally, really thinking through, how do you visibilize women's contributions? One of the things that we found across our work, and not just the work that we're doing on women in leadership in the legal sector, but is that very often the contributions of those who are invisible and have no voice are just left out of decision-making spaces. They're left out of convenings, all of those spaces. And so it was really about, how do you very intentionally make this visible? How do you, not just in terms of courtroom outcomes, but really, what is that? And really focusing on that journey. So, from start to finish or start to end, what is that journey that it took to get to that? What were the challenges? How did you overcome those challenges? Really trying to make justice something alive that was not simply within a courtroom, but really something that is lived, shared, inclusive. And in doing so, you were making really visible the impact that women have on justice, on law, at society at large. You were talking about a bigger picture and saying, and there is evidence around this, and I think a lot of the evidence has been done with parliamentarians, for instance, and what happens when you have more women in leadership. And so, really trying to use that kind of thinking and saying, this is what happens when you have women in leadership in the law and justice sector. These are the potential for change in societies when you.
The important point that you make, Mandira. What is the potential and what is the difference when we have women in leadership? And not only, like you said, thinking about leadership generally, but what does specifically feminist leadership look like? And what kind of ripple effects does that feminist leadership have? And so, how do we convey this brand or this style of leadership, right? Because it's not unique to women. Men can have feminist leadership too. How do we
Absolutely.
convey this as new and different? And how do we use this to change the narrative about women in law and how they do actually shift society's views and the concept of leadership more broadly?
That's a really good question, Amy, and it's something that we've had a lot of kind of self-reflection and back and forth around. And I think for us, there's been a lot of conversation back and forth about, is it only women's leadership or is it feminist leadership, and kind of oscillating between the two. And I think that's even more relevant in today's global context. And we really kind of come down and said, no, we wanted to do this from a feminist leadership perspective, and really about moving beyond what it meant to move beyond traditional hierarchical models and create more inclusive, collaborative kind of models for law and justice. And that's something that we've pushed. Some of the stories that we're talking about, that's kind of the conversations we pushed with many of the women that we're highlighting, is that, beyond. Oh, I've talked a lot about, really focusing on the story to leadership, but then once these women have been in leadership positions, what that's looked like in terms of challenging certain norms, in terms of pushing values of social justice. Sometimes it's had impacts on things like climate change. It's had impacts on recognizing, for instance, the intersectionality of marginalization or discrimination. So really, and some of what we're doing is trying to get to that endpoint and say, well, actually, once you have women in leadership, this is what that looks like. And it means more, it means more conversations around climate change. It means a more intersectional approach to education, to health, to all of these pieces. And a lot of the women that we're trying to highlight and showcase are also being chosen with that in mind. And also, I think really important to call out here, and it's been a very interesting piece for us, has been looking at, as the campaign has gone live, the comments and the engagement across many different opinions and perspectives and points of view, but really using that space and that engagement to push back on, you know, and reinforce that feminist leadership. So I think, and that's, I think, a really important part of how, and going back to, Purpose's approach, how we come to the campaign, especially on digital platforms where so many of these conversations are now happening, really using some of those comments areas, some of those engagement to question and give examples and talk about really, what does feminist leadership mean? What does it look like? What can it look like? What is the potential that it brings to the table? And I'm hoping that through that engagement is where you start seeing those conversations. The conversations are hopefully that first step in challenging, entrenched power structures, or changing a mind, or having somebody look at something differently, changing a narrative, etc.
So it's clear, Mandira, that I think part of this is about how do you engage in a dialogue. And part of what it seems the Difference She Makes campaign is seeking to do in amplifying voices, but in also directly engaging with those that are seeing the campaign through the different mediums, is to get this conversation underway with regards to a new modality, right? In terms of a perspective on even what does leadership mean. And you talk about this feminist perspective in terms of, the women that you're targeting and the people that are going to be kind of at the center of this campaign. How do they themselves engage with this new kind of modality also, right? Because people are centered in the systems in which they're also formed. And you're asking in many ways for people to to a different kind of way in terms of their own leadership. So how are they shaping and informing this campaign? And how are you kind of collaborating with them?
One of the things that our research has always told us, and one of the things we've realized when we do movement building work, is that you need to. It's not a static process. It's very dynamic, and you have to constantly engage with the audience that you're trying to shift and feed that back in. And one of the things that we've noted in that process of kind of constantly iterating is that you have to keep building the case for equity in the workplace. You have to keep building the case for why leadership should be supported institutionally. What are those systemic and cultural norms that are holding it back? And so it's not about just one narrative going out there, but constantly reinforcing that narrative. And going back to that, what I said about where you can spark a dialogue, our aim is to engage with all different levels within the sector and those adjacent to it to show how holding women back doesn't just impact women, but actually impacts it holds entire societies back. It holds our communities back. And so what we're trying to do is really target both women, for instance, who are starting on their journey and might be disengaged because, it's hard. You're trying to be a lawyer and you're trying to, kind of live life, which could include caregiving responsibilities. It could include financial responsibilities. Many of these young people starting on their journeys, they just don't have the time. So one of the pieces is to really try and capture their imagination, capture why this is important for them and how it can impact them, and really try and create that groundswell almost. And then on the other side of it is really about who are those who passively complicit, there's those who are actively engaged with a backlash on gender, but there's also a very large proportion of the audience we're trying to engage with that is really passively complicit. It's fence sitting. Again, it's busy. It's trying to just get by. It's got many things that are on their plate. There's institutions that they're part of that they need to fit into, and they don't necessarily want to rock the boat. We're also they have power, but they've also internalized the system that they're engaged in, and so may not be sending the ladder back down, or reaching down to grab those who are coming up on that ladder. And so we've been thinking of that as kind of those who are guarding the status quo. And so how do we kind of ensure that what we're doing hits on both of those pieces? It's aspirational, inspiring, and feels relevant to young women in the sector who see this as something that they can build support for and they want to demand, but at the same time, kind of sparking something for those who've been sitting in these positions who haven't necessarily engaged with the reality of what women's leadership in the sector looks like, and can be influenced and made supporters, and who can be influenced to open the doors. Those are the ones who will open the doors, um you know like I said, put their hands down to bring up the ladder, and that's a key piece to trying to build out. And that's some of the key pieces of audiences that we're trying to engage with across the campaign.
Mandira, I think what you're describing here is not just us talking about or purporting or trying to influence others to simply be like, feminist leadership is where it's at and this is what we need to do, but also using these principles in the movement building itself, right? In the ways that you engage, in the storytelling, and the ways that you're trying to shift the narrative, feminist principles of collaboration and partnership and coalition building. And indeed, we first met in trying to build this coalition of women in leadership and law partners to contribute, as you say, to this campaign and creating this groundswell of support. Can you talk to us a little bit more about what role partners like us, like IWJ, or other co-impact Willow Coalition members play in creating this movement and carrying it forward?
I think so. For us right now, it's about creating the platform and really, at the moment, leveraging and amplifying and building from and with everything that partners like yourselves have done, but also to really I think for me, the vision for this work is that at some stage, partners and the women that we are aiming to impact lead the platform with their demands and their work. It's really push for institutional reform. My vision of this is a global platform of different kinds, not led of course by the will partners who have been involved in this work for so long, but also bringing on those who are engaging in adjacent ways. It could be student associations in legal colleges. It could be those thinking through women's workforce participation, gender organizations who are thinking about that. Just really building and creating a kind of global platform that holds us all together and pushes us forward, because I think at the moment we're in a moment where we either kind of sit back and say this backlash and the backsliding is just too much, but I just feel like it's an opportunity, and things like supporting women's leadership, building coalitions, campaigns like Difference She Makes have the power to actually push back, to hold the line, so to speak, which is so critical at this time. So for me, that's how the partners and the platform come together. And it could potentially be a really powerful way to hold the line, to learn from what we're doing in this field, to expand that to health, to medicine, to economics, to climate, to education, and all of these spaces where we know that women's leadership drives forward significant justice and equity. And why not push for that across multiple sectors at this time?
I think that's right. There's an opportunity, as I think you're positing here, for using this moment in time, not to kind of sit back, but as you say, to hold the line and to be able to push forward that there has been, incredible kind of changes and advancements made. And this is not a moment to kind of go into hiding, or to not kind of leverage that, and to look at, the kind of broader coalition of people that can really continue to push forward for the changes and the shifts that are necessary in transforming our societies as a whole. So you talk a little bit about how this campaign also can have an impact on different sectors, but can you also speak a little bit about how the campaign can influence not only the women that are, within the sector in law, but also broader perceptions about leadership and justice overall?
So I'm going to talk starting from some of the context that we've been working on. Amy Jane, as you know, the campaign actually has started as a campaign that's focused in the East Africa and West Africa regions, but also looking at kind of more global power shifts as well. And interestingly, women in law in the African context, the research shows that they have very far-reaching, broad, wide impacts. And so whether that's at a community level, whether that's a reproductive justice level, whether that's at, like I said, climate change, it's at a tackling corruption, as we've seen in Zambia and other countries. And so by virtue of engaging with women in leadership in the legal and justice sector, we're challenging, I believe, larger perceptions, I think, of what societies hold around women in leadership at large. And I think linking it to law and justice in this region is really interesting, because much of the women in leadership in law, especially in the current generation and the previous generation, has really emerged from feminist, anti-colonial, anti-apartheid movements, and it's broadening that agenda forward. And it's really exciting to build and learn from that agenda. And so we're seeing, for instance, that women redefine justice to reflect their lived experiences, their lived realities. It's not only about a courtroom outcome, but really about how does justice play out in your day-to-day lives. It's about, making space for others to come in, for others to follow. From our experience and what we're seeing and what we're hearing, there's a really strong focus on mentorship, sisterhood, solidarity. And that's an exciting piece, because it's such a critical part of any feminist work. And, we started earlier in this conversation, the point of feminist leadership, and kind of engaging with that view of mentorship, sisterhood, solidarity, and bringing that in and to how we think about leadership is so important, and such an important part of feminist leadership. There's also kind of such a range of sectors and issues that are being touched by the women that we're engaging with. Some is, what you'd expect: gender-based violence, reproductive justice, sexuality and rights. But there's also, as I said, environmental law. There's women working on displacement, conflict, peace. So really kind of, I think that it's really exciting because, we're not only talking about law as a sector, but how that impacts all of these pieces of the puzzle and the social justice puzzle, so to speak. And so it allows that social justice to be strengthened as something that is intersectional, that is community based, and make it more powerful.
Indeed, Mandira, this concept of intersectionality is also a powerful one, right? Like the lived experiences of women, not just from their identity as being a woman, but thinking, like you said, about broader ideas around anti-colonialism, anti-apartheid movements, and the other intersecting identities that women bring to the table when they're administering justice or just living their lives. And again, we've talked about the importance of telling these women's stories and amplifying and elevating that regionally up to globally. When you're thinking about how you measure success of a campaign like this, both in the short term and the long term, where is that focus? Is it focused just on shifting the perceptions? Is it focused on just amplifying the narratives? How do you measure whether or not this is having a broader impact?
So measuring success for us is not just about, and it's really important. Yes, of course, it's really important to measure success, but measuring success is not just about the numbers. So I mean, if I wanted to throw out numbers, in 4 weeks we've hit 1 million people, but that's not the measurement that we're aiming for. That's a measurement that's great and makes us feel good, but it's really about listening and learning. So in terms from a very kind of measurement perspective, we're running what we call dynamic surveys and questionnaires that get audiences to engage with the campaign. And that's one of the critical pieces of for us, is that it's not simply about you seeing what we're putting out there, but really engaging with it, questioning it, arguing with it, really becoming part of the community. And so that's the piece that we were looking at, how we measure and how we build off of that. And that's why, even earlier I talked about how important it is to have that conversation with the audience that we're having. And so a lot of our questionnaires and surveys are trying to really look at that engagement in a meaningful way. We're looking at building a community. So people joining the campaign. We've had, again, in 4 weeks, about 50 women come forward and say, I'd like to share my story. And that's quite phenomenal because it's not easy. Social media and digital spaces are interesting in the sense that they make it easy, yet also harder to share one's personal stories. They make it easy in the sense that they can be anonymous, they can be non-judgmental, they can be safe spaces, but they can actually also be exactly the opposite. In our experience, to have women really come up and identify and say, we'd like to share our leadership story or what we've seen, is a measure of success, because it means that we're being able to drive not just engagement, but we're also being able to drive trust. We're being able to create a space in which women feel safe enough to share a story or share their experiences without fear of backlash, or that they will be protected, or they will have a larger community standing behind them if there is some sort of backlash. So to me, these are kind of metrics that are harder to measure, but these are the metrics that become really interesting. And for me, the success of the campaign. And then the other pieces, and I think that's a longer term piece for us, because that takes time and it builds, is really to see if this campaign can make institutional asks, and those institutional asks can drive women to come together around institutional asks within their firms or within their countries or within their law associations or their bar associations, that shift norms and that change, make measurable change for them.
Thank you so much for, I think, highlighting, the different ways in which you're measuring impact and success, both at the short and long term, as well as where you see this going in terms of institutional shifts. and, speaking about the fact that how you're thinking in terms of the success metrics is also not only the level of engagement that you're able to have, beyond the numbers, as you said. And it is impressive, to highlight how many people you've been able to reach, but that engagement as being critical, and that engagement also with those that you want to amplify their voices. I think certainly for IWJ as a network, that's always been, at the center, is creating that space where our members and our community feel as though they're able to tell their story, and they're able to engage with one another in safety and with respect. So I think that that's such a wonderful way of thinking about how this campaign is dynamic, even in terms of how it's understanding its own impact overall. Mandira, as we're closing out today's conversation with you, one of the things that we want to ask you, and we've been asking all of our guests, is, what do you think overall is going to have ostensibly the greatest impact in terms of the advancing women's leadership in law? So if you can give one word or concept, that would be wonderful.
Oh god, that might be your hardest question. One word is always hard for me, but I have to say I've been thinking a lot about disrupting, dismantling, rewriting in the recent past. I heard someone say last year that hope can be as viral as hate, and I've been kind of trying to think that through in terms of what does that look like? What is feminist hope? Because to be a feminist has required huge amounts of hope over the years. But really, what is feminist hope? But I hope, my wish is that this work on advancing women's leadership in law will be able to do some of that. We'll be able to disrupt. We'll be able to create a vision of new leadership. We'll be able to empower more women leaders, because it's in that empowerment of multiple women who kind of stand up and say, you know, I want more than what I have right now. I deserve more. This is not just. I think that is what makes me very excited, and I'm hoping that the work that all of us are doing will have that impact and create a kind of groundswell or a tidal wave for women's leadership, not just in law but across all sectors.
Absolutely. And I mean, I think, this idea of feminist movement building, feminist leadership, and the way that we tell women's stories, right? And what our responsibility is, and why we're here today on this podcast is how do we also amplify these lived experiences? How do we tell these stories in a way that honor and also are engaging and don't replicate those hierarchies and continue to build that community? That's something that at IWJ that's so important to us, that sisterhood, that solidarity, making sure that women feel safe in their communities, in the courts, and just generally.
Absolutely. Completely agree. I think amplifying, giving voice, making things visible, I think that's what's making this campaign so exciting for us.
Definitely. And disrupting and dismantling.
Yes, yes, love it. Disrupting, dismantling.
Yeah.
So important. Well, Mandira, as we've heard today, Difference She Makes is more than a campaign. It is a call to recognize and amplify the leadership of women across the legal profession, to shift narratives through feminist leadership and movement building. And by shifting the stories we tell, we shift the perception of who leads, how justice is delivered, and what inclusive institutions can look like. This work, like you said, isn't just about visibility, it's about power, possibility, and paving the way for the next generation of women to lead without limitation.
I think the task ahead is to keep telling these stories, keep disrupting and dismantling, as you've well put, harmful narratives, and keep showing the world the difference women make when they are in positions of influence. When we recognize and celebrate the difference she makes, we create conditions for deeper systemic change in the law and leadership and society as a whole. And the more we tell these stories, the more space we create for the next generation to step forward with confidence. That's the power ultimately of narrative change, and that's the difference she makes. So thank you so much, Mandira, for joining us today.
Yes,
Thank
thank you.
Thank you for having me. I've really enjoyed chatting with you.
Everyone should be on the lookout for more hero stories and more coming their way from the Difference She Makes campaign. Thank you for tuning into Justice Beyond the Bench. If you enjoyed this conversation, don't forget to subscribe so you never miss an episode. Want to learn more about our work and support our mission? Visit us at iawj.org, where you can explore our programs, join our global network, or make a donation to help advance gender equity in judiciaries around the world. See you next time.